What if I told you that a single phone call made in a Swiss dining room would trigger the collapse of a centuries-old financial empire and awaken an entire continent? What if I told you that this call lasted less than 5 minutes, yet its ripple effects would reshape African geopolitics forever? This is the story of how one young African leader turned the tables on European colonialism with nothing but dignity, courage, and an unshakable belief in his people's worth. But before we dive into that fateful evening in Geneva, we need to understand who Ibrahim Traoré really is, and why his actions would send shockwaves through the corridors of power from London to Paris to Berlin. Ibrahim Traoré wasn't born into wealth or privilege. He grew up in the dusty streets of Ouagadougou, where the red earth stains your shoes and the scorching sun reminds you daily that survival is never guaranteed. His grandmother, a woman whose hands bore the scars of colonial labor camps, would tell him stories that most history books refuse to print. Stories of villages burned for refusing to surrender their gold, stories of children taken as tribute to European mining companies. Stories of African leaders who mysteriously died after refusing to sign exploitative contracts. These weren't just stories to young Ibrahim. They were prophecies of what he would one day face. By the age of 34, Captain Ibrahim Traoré had done what many thought impossible. Through a military coup that lasted just hours and claimed not a single life, he had overthrown a government that had ruled Burkina Faso for decades. But unlike the typical African strongman narrative that Western media loves to peddle, Traoré's revolution was different. It was surgical, principled, and driven by a single obsession: restoring dignity to his people. The morning after his bloodless coup, instead of moving into the presidential palace, Traoré chose to remain in his modest military barracks. When asked why, his response would later become legendary among African youth. "How can I live in luxury while my people struggle for clean water?" This wasn't political theater. This was the authentic voice of a man who understood that leadership meant service, not privilege. But what the world didn't know was that Traoré's true test was coming. Within weeks of taking power, his simple phone would ring with an offer that would define not just his presidency, but the future of African sovereignty itself. The invitation arrived on cream-colored paper, embossed with a coat of arms that had adorned European documents of conquest for over 2 centuries. The Rothschild family, through their subsidiary Helvetic International, cordially invited the new president of Burkina Faso to Geneva for discussions of mutual benefit and continental development. The language was diplomatic, but those who understood the history of African-European relations knew exactly what this meant. This was the recruitment call. Every African leader received it, usually within months of taking power. Some went willingly, seduced by promises of development aid and foreign investment. Others went reluctantly, knowing that refusal meant economic isolation. But all went, because the alternative seemed worse than whatever humiliation awaited them in European boardrooms. Traoré's advisors urged caution. They reminded him of what happened to leaders who defied the financial powers of the West. Thomas Sankara, his hero and predecessor as Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader, had been assassinated just 4 years into his presidency, many believed because he refused to play by the rules of international capitalism. Patrice Lumumba of Congo had lasted only months before his execution, his crime being the audacity to suggest that African resources should benefit African people. But Traoré had studied these men not as cautionary tales, but as roadmaps. He understood something that his predecessors perhaps didn't have the luxury of knowing. The world had changed. China's rise, Russia's resurgence, Turkey's growing influence in Africa, and, most importantly, the digital age's ability to instantly expose truth to global audiences had created new possibilities for African leaders willing to take calculated risks. "I will go," he told his advisors, "but not as a beggar. I will go as the representative of a sovereign nation, and I will act accordingly." None of them fully understood what he meant by that. They would soon find out. Geneva in October is a city that wears its wealth like armor. The morning Traoré's modest delegation landed, the Swiss Alps stood as silent witnesses to centuries of money laundering, tax evasion, and the quiet management of the world's most morally questionable fortunes. This was the neutral ground where dictators banked their stolen billions, where corporations planned their next exploitation ventures, and where African leaders came to negotiate away their nation's dignity. The Helvetic International Building rose into the crisp Swiss sky like a monument to financial domination. Built from Carrara marble and African gold, its construction had cost more than the annual GDP of most sub-Saharan nations. The irony was lost on no one except those who worked inside its walls. Every inch of the building screamed power, from the uniformed guards who looked like they could stop small wars to the artwork adorning the lobby, pieces acquired during the colonial era and now displayed like trophies of conquest. Traoré stepped from his commercial flight wearing the same simple military uniform he wore in Ouagadougou, while other African leaders arrived in private jets funded by foreign loans they could never repay, wearing suits tailored in London and watches worth more than their people's annual salaries. The young president of Burkina Faso looked exactly like what he was, a soldier who had never forgotten where he came from. The Rothschild family's reaction to his appearance would later become the subject of leaked recordings that would destroy their reputation forever. But in that moment, as Traoré walked through the marble lobby, he was focused on something else entirely. His eyes moved systematically across the African artifacts displayed throughout the building. A Benin bronze here, a Malayan sculpture there, a Congolese mask in the corner. Each piece told a story of cultural theft disguised as cultural exchange. What the Rothschilds didn't know was that Traoré had spent months preparing for this meeting, not by studying financial documents or memorizing economic statistics, but by researching the history of every African artifact in their collection. He knew which village each mask had been stolen from. He knew which colonial administrator had acquired each sculpture. He knew the names of the African artists whose work now decorated the walls of their oppressors. This wasn't just due diligence. This was preparation for war. Victoria Rothschild had been born into wealth so old and vast that she had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with money. At 62, she moved through the world with the confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. Her pearl necklace, a family heirloom crafted from South Pacific pearls harvested by enslaved divers, had been worn by Rothschild women for over a century. Each pearl represented not just wealth, but the systematic exploitation of human lives for aesthetic pleasure. Her husband, Charles, at 67, embodied the particular arrogance of inherited power. His Swiss watch, worth more than most African countries spent on education monthly, had been a gift from apartheid-era South African mining executives, grateful for the Rothschild family's discreet investment in their gold extraction operations. The blood diamonds in his cufflinks told their own story of African suffering transformed into European luxury. But it was their son, Marcus, 26 and fresh from Cambridge, who represented the new generation of colonial thinking. Unlike his parents, who at least maintained the pretense of diplomatic courtesy, Marcus had grown up in the social media age where racism could be packaged as humor and exploitation marketed as entrepreneurship. His Instagram account, followed by 500,000 privileged youth across Europe and America, regularly featured jokes about civilizing Africa and bringing democracy to the dark continent. His followers loved it. African activists monitored every post, waiting for him to cross the line that would finally expose his family's true nature. That line was about to be obliterated. The family had prepared for this meeting with the casual confidence of predators approaching prey. They had done this dance dozens of times with African leaders, and the script never changed. Display overwhelming wealth to establish dominance. Offer seemingly generous terms to create gratitude. insert subtle racial condescension to maintain psychological superiority, secure mineral rights at a fraction of their true value, celebrate another successful development partnership. What they couldn't have anticipated was that this time, their prey had come to hunt them. The Rothschild dining room was a museum of stolen wealth masquerading as sophisticated taste. The table, carved from a single piece of Brazilian rosewood, had cost more than most nations spent on health care annually. The irony that they were about to discuss African development while sitting around a table made from South American environmental destruction was entirely lost on the hosts. As servants moved between the chairs like ghosts, their silence spoke volumes about the power dynamics that governed this space. These weren't employees. They were witnesses to conversations that would never appear in official diplomatic records. Tonight, their silence would prove more valuable than all the gold in Burkina Faso's mines. The meal began with delicacies flown in from around the world. Truffles from France, aged beef from Argentina, wine older than most African constitutions. Each course was a demonstration of the family's ability to transform the world's resources into their personal pleasure. They spoke casually about acquiring entire agricultural regions, about redirecting river systems for industrial projects, about relocating populations to access mineral deposits. This was the language of gods discussing mortals, and they expected their African guests to be appropriately grateful for the privilege of witnessing their power. Victoria began the evening's entertainment with stories of her charitable work in Africa. She described building schools in Mali with the tone of someone feeding animals at a zoo, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that colonial administrators had perfected over centuries. She spoke of African children as though they were pets to be trained, African women as breeding stock to be managed, African men as labor to be organized. The gratitude in their eyes, she said, cutting her truffle with surgical precision. When we bring them clean water and basic education, it's really quite touching how little it takes to make them happy. Charles nodded sagely, swirling wine worth more than a teacher's annual salary. Of course, we must be careful not to spoil them with too much development too quickly. They need to earn their progress, learn to appreciate what we're giving them. But it was Marcus who delivered the most devastating blow, his prep school accent cutting through the room like a blade dipped in centuries of racial superiority. "Father, remember that village chief who tried to negotiate with us in Ghana? The way he stumbled over basic English words while trying to discuss mineral rights? I posted the video on my Instagram. My followers absolutely loved watching him try to sound intelligent." The family's laughter filled the room like the sound of glass breaking against stone. They were performing their superiority for an audience they assumed shared their contempt for African intelligence and dignity. What they didn't realize was that their performance was being recorded by their own security system, and their audience of one was taking notes that would soon be read by presidents, prime ministers, and freedom fighters across the globe. Ibrahim Traoré had learned the power of silence during his military training. In combat, the soldier who speaks first often dies first. In negotiations, the person who fills every pause with words reveals their desperation. Tonight, his silence was becoming a weapon more powerful than any artillery. He ate simple bread while they consumed delicacies, drank water while they indulged in vintage wines, maintained perfect posture while they lounged in inherited arrogance. Every gesture was calculated to contrast their excess with his restraint, their weakness with his strength. But inside his mind, a different kind of storm was building. He thought of his grandmother's hands, scarred by colonial whips, as he watched Victoria's manicured fingers gesture dismissively toward an entire continent. He remembered his mother's stories of forced labor as Charles described African workers as naturally suited to dangerous mining conditions. He recalled the mass graves of resistance fighters as Marcus joked about the intellectual inferiority of African leadership. The ancestors weren't just whispering now, they were screaming. Thomas Sankara's voice echoed through his consciousness. "He who feeds you controls you." Patrice Lumumba's final words resonated in his heart. The day will come when history will have its say. Kwame Nkrumah's warning reverberated through his soul. We face neither east nor west. We face forward. But it was his grandmother's final lesson that gave him the strength to do what came next. Dignity, my child, is the one thing they can never take from you, but it is also the one thing you must never give away. The moment had come to choose between $900 million and the respect of 1.3 billion African people. For Ibrahim Traoré, it wasn't even a choice. The simple black phone in Traoré's pocket had witnessed revolution. It had coordinated the bloodless coup that brought him to power. It had connected him with freedom fighters across the continent. It had carried the voices of his people from the villages of Burkina Faso to the presidential palace. Tonight, it would carry a message that would reshape the relationship between Africa and Europe forever. The device looked humble compared to the gold-plated gadgets scattered across the Rothschild table, but its power was about to move mountains. As Traoré slowly reached for his phone, the conversation died. The family sensed that something fundamental had shifted in the room's dynamic. Victoria's wine glass stopped halfway to her lips. Charles's laughter caught in his throat. Marcus looked up from his social media feed, finally registering that the quiet man across the table was no longer their passive audience. Minister Konate. Traoré's voice carried the authority of someone who had toppled governments with phone calls. His English was precise, each word chosen for maximum impact. Please draft the immediate termination of all negotiations with Helvetic International. The words hit the room like lightning strikes. Charles lunged forward desperately, his carefully maintained composure shattering like expensive crystal. "Wait, please, there's been a misunderstanding." But Traoré's raised hand silenced him with the finality of a judge's gavel. Victoria's wine glass slipped from nerveless fingers, red liquid spreading across white linen like blood on snow. Marcus stared in horror as his family's African empire began crumbling with each word the young president spoke. "Furthermore," Traoré continued, his eyes never leaving the family's stricken faces, "prepare a comprehensive report on Helvetic International's colonial practices for immediate distribution to the African Union, the United Nations Human Rights Council, and the International Criminal Court." The room's temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. Charles's face turned the color of ash as he realized his family's dirty secrets were about to be exposed to 54 African nations and the world's human rights organizations. Victoria began hyperventilating, her designer dress suddenly feeling like a burial shroud. Marcus's social media empire of racist jokes suddenly seemed like evidence for war crimes tribunals. "The recordings of this evening's conversation," Traoré added, his aide's voice confirming from Ouagadougou, "will be included in the report as primary evidence of systematic racial discrimination in international business practices." The family's centuries-old dynasty was crumbling in real time, broadcast live to government officials who would never again question the young president's commitment to African dignity. The news exploded across global media faster than any political scandal in modern history. Within hours, Sotra Dignity Over Dollars was trending in 12 languages across 6 continents. The leaked audio of the Rothschild family's racist dinner conversation played on repeat across international news networks, social media platforms, and government briefings worldwide. In African capitals from Lagos to Nairobi, from Cairo to Cape Town, presidents called emergency cabinet meetings to discuss the implications of Traoré's bold stance. Ghana's president tweeted a simple message that was retweeted millions of times within hours: "Dignity is not for sale." Kenya's leader announced the immediate review of all foreign investment contracts using Geneva Principles as the new standard for respectful partnership. The African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa buzzed with unprecedented activity as diplomats prepared statements supporting Burkina Faso's rejection of neo-colonial arrogance. Young people across the continent changed their profile pictures to Traoré's image, celebrating a leader who had refused to bow before golden chains. But the earthquake wasn't limited to Africa. In European capitals, panic spread through corporate boardrooms like a plague as executives realized the implications of Traoré's public rejection. The London Stock Exchange watched billions in market capitalization evaporate as Rothschild Industries' share price crashed like a meteor. Swiss banks held emergency meetings calculating their exposure to African deals that might suddenly become worthless. German industrial giants called crisis management firms, knowing their own colonial-era contracts would now face the same moral scrutiny. French corporations that had fed off African resources for decades found themselves vulnerable to the same reckoning that had destroyed the Rothschilds in less than 24 hours. Victoria Rothschild retreated from public life, her charity organizations issuing statements distancing themselves from her toxic behavior. The woman who had commanded boardrooms and bent governments to her will became a hermit in her Geneva penthouse, watching her life's work crumble through bulletproof windows. Charles faced congressional hearings about corporate practices in Africa. His racist comments played repeatedly for lawmakers and global audiences to judge. The man who had bought and sold nations like commodities found himself speechless before honest African leaders who refused to be intimidated by his inherited wealth. Marcus dropped out of Cambridge after student protests made his presence impossible. His social media accounts flooded with millions of responses from outraged Africans and their global allies. His trust fund faced legal challenges from shareholders horrified by his family's public disgrace, while universities across Europe banned him from their campuses. The Rothschild name, synonymous with financial power for centuries, became synonymous with racism and colonial arrogance almost overnight. 6 months after the Geneva incident, the transformation across Africa was nothing short of miraculous. The $900 million that Traoré had rejected seemed laughably small compared to the billions now flowing into Burkina Faso from partners who respected African dignity. China offered infrastructure development deals based on mutual benefit rather than resource extraction. Russia provided military equipment and training to help African nations defend their sovereignty. Turkey competed with Gulf nations to offer agricultural partnerships that respected local food security needs. India shared renewable energy technology that could power Africa's future without environmental destruction. Most importantly, African nations began working together with unprecedented coordination. The Continental Free Trade Area gained momentum as countries realized their strength lay in unity rather than individual submission to foreign powers. Nigeria canceled 3 exploitative oil deals, citing Geneva principles of dignified partnership. South Africa expelled mining companies that refused to share profits equitably with local communities. The young president's principled stance had awakened a sleeping giant that had been dormant for too long. In Ouagadougou, children walked to schools built with funds that would have gone to Swiss bank accounts. The gold mines that Helvetic International had coveted now funded hospitals staffed by Cuban doctors and equipped with Chinese technology. Ibrahim Traoré stood in the courtyard of the new Thomas Sankara University, watching young Burkinabe engineers design solar panels that would power their nation's future. But the most profound change wasn't economic or political. It was psychological. For the first time in generations, African leaders walked into international negotiations as equals rather than supplicants. They demanded respect rather than begging for acceptance. They offered partnership rather than accepting exploitation. The Geneva Doctrine, as historians would later call it, had become the new standard for African diplomacy worldwide. Today, that simple black phone sits in a place of honor in the presidential palace in Ouagadougou. Not displayed as a symbol of power, but as a reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to accept disrespect. Tourists from across Africa and the diaspora come to see the device that changed history. Students study the 5-minute conversation that triggered the collapse of a financial empire. Historians analyze how one man's courage sparked a continental awakening that continues to reshape global power dynamics. But for Ibrahim Traoré, now recognized as one of Africa's most respected leaders, the phone represents something simpler and more profound. It represents the moment when he chose to honor his ancestors rather than enrich his enemies. The moment when he chose dignity over dollars, sovereignty over submission, freedom over fool's gold. The young president often tells visitors that the real power wasn't in the phone call itself, but in the centuries of resistance that made it possible. Every enslaved African who chose death over bondage, every colonial subject who chose dignity over survival, every freedom fighter who chose justice over personal safety. "I am not the hero of this story," he says, standing before the portraits of Sankara, Lumumba, and Nkrumah that now adorn his office. "I am simply the latest chapter in a book that my ancestors began writing centuries ago. They paid the price for African dignity with their lives. The least I could do was protect it with a phone call." 3 years later, the ripple effects of that Geneva dinner continued to reshape global politics. The Rothschild Empire never recovered. Their African investments worthless, their reputation destroyed, their influence reduced to a cautionary tale taught in business schools as an example of how racism can destroy centuries of accumulated power. Other European financial dynasties learned the lesson. Gone are the days when African leaders could be summoned to European capitals for humiliation disguised as diplomacy. The new generation of African leadership demands meetings on equal terms in neutral venues, with respect for sovereignty and dignity as non-negotiable prerequisites. Young people across the world study Ibrahim Traoré's example as proof that moral courage can defeat institutional power. His rejection of $900 million has been analyzed in universities from Harvard to Oxford, not as an economic decision, but as a masterclass in principled leadership. The African Continental Free Trade Area is now the world's largest trading bloc by participating countries, with intra-African trade growing by over 300% since the Geneva incident. African currencies have strengthened against the dollar and euro as continental solidarity replaced individual dependency on Western financial systems. But perhaps most importantly, African children now grow up with a different understanding of their place in the world. They see themselves not as recipients of foreign charity, but as inheritors of vast wealth and profound dignity. They learn about leaders who chose honor over money, who faced down empires with nothing but moral authority. The red soil of Africa, which has witnessed so much suffering and exploitation, now bears witness to a renaissance of pride and possibility that seemed impossible just a few years ago. The story of Ibrahim Traoré's Geneva dinner raises a question that every leader, every citizen, every human being must eventually face. What is the price of your dignity? For the Rothschild family, dignity was negotiable, tradable, expendable in pursuit of profit. For Ibrahim Traoré, dignity was priceless, non-negotiable, worth more than all the gold in African mines. Their different answers to this question determined not just their personal fates, but the future of an entire continent. Today, as new challenges face African nations and new forms of neocolonialism emerge through technology and financial manipulation, Traoré's example continues to inspire leaders who understand that true wealth comes not from what you can buy, but from what you refuse to sell. The phone call that lasted 5 minutes proved a truth that tyrants and exploiters have spent centuries trying to hide. Dignity, once awakened and defended with courage, is the most powerful force on earth, and no amount of money, no matter how vast, can purchase a single ounce of it from someone who understands its true value. The young man who walked into that Geneva dining room carrying nothing but the hopes of his people walked out having changed the course of history itself. Not through violence or war, but through the simple, radical act of refusing to accept disrespect. In a world where everything seems to have a price, Ibrahim Traoré reminded us that some things remain priceless, and those are the things most worth fighting for.